Welcome to a new episode of the Lawyers Coach podcast. I'm Claire Rayson, your host, former lawyer and coach, and I am speaking to a number of guests and friends this series to find out a little bit about what makes lawyers tick and what law firms and lawyers can be doing differently. In today's episode, I am joined by James Smither. James is Global Head of Risk Management at Freshfields, and he shares with me what that role means and what it entails. But he's also a co-founder of the Legal Neurodiversity Network. And James speaks to me about his passion for neurodiversity inclusion advocacy and shares some top tips for firms who want to make their workplaces more inclusive. James, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
So we always start these podcasts by finding out a little bit about how our guests have found themselves in the legal sector. So I'm curious about your background and how it was that you went from, I believe, mining and other sectors into legal.
I mean, yes, definitely more by accident than by design. To be transparent, probably a minority of your guests have zero legal training and zero legal experience and legal education. That's me, definitely. Never studied the law for even an hour. Before I started in the legal sector, which was with Herbert Smith Freehills back in January 2019, my career had basically been predominantly what lawyers call fee earning, what I would call client-facing consulting work on risk management. But there's kind of two different slugs of that at various different consultancies of different shapes and sizes and flavors, sandwiched around 2 and a bit years working for, you mentioned mining, and the world's biggest steel manufacturing and mining company. And I really enjoyed that. That was definitely a highlight of my career. So for reasons we'll probably get into later on, in January 2019, I found myself wanting to get out of the fee earning client facing world. I was at PwC by that point, a director at PwC on risk management advisory. So I was basically looking for more in-house jobs. I wanted to kind of refine the in-house role that I'd previously enjoyed in the mining world. And yeah, the legal opportunity at HSF kind of presented itself. It hadn't been the plan. Like I said, I was kind of agnostic about which sector to work in. But when that opportunity did present itself, it felt right for a number of reasons, to be honest, despite that lack of background that I mentioned in the law, perhaps because of it, partly. And I've never looked back. So yeah, it's been a good move so far.
And one of the things, so there are a number of questions jump into my mind from there, but where to start? One of the things that jumps into my mind is often when you kind of come into a sector afresh, you're able to challenge some of those things that when you're in it, you kind of take for granted. And I wonder if you can kind of think back to then, what were some of the things when you kind of moved across from PwC into Herbert Smith that you started to notice, it's interesting that the legal sector does it this way, whatever it might be?
That's a great question. I have to be slightly careful in how I characterize this, but I guess to a certain extent, I was quite naive. I thought there'd be a lot of analogies between the accounting world that I'd come from, where I was client facing, and then moving into the legal advisory world, similar model partnerships, time recording, people capital rather than, manufacturing or heavy assets capital. I thought they'd be very similar. And actually, I was very surprised to learn quite quickly how different they are, not just the kind of mentality of accountants versus lawyers and the sort of different scales of finance, but actually a lot around appetite for risk and attitude to risk and risk management. And yeah, I've done a lot of thinking over the years as to why that might be, but it is interesting. Actually, I think to HSF, Herbert Smith's credit, that's one reason they hired me. I think they wanted an outside view, exactly to your point. So a lot of people in law firms, as you know, spend 20, 30 years, not just in the same sector, but actually in the same firm and really don't have an outside perspective. So I think they actually did want what I had, which was coming from a different, but still regulated advisory world, but also the experience I had from advising so many public companies, FTSE 100, Fortune 500 type clients, and knowing what good risk management looked like, because there was an acceptance from HSF. And I think we'd say what more widely across legal that it's more backwards on risk management. It's far less refined, advanced, developed than, I guess, public listed companies have to be. So they wanted that perspective, and that's why they brought me in.
And obviously HSF, a big firm, and you're now with Freshfields, another big firm who are able to have someone like you in your role who's responsible for risk. Perhaps for some of the kind of maybe smaller firms listening, or maybe firms, overseas that perhaps do or don't have that kind of role, can you kind of sum up what it is that you do and why it is that you're needed?
I love that question. Yeah, I haven't got it quite down to 30 seconds because we were told we need an elevator pitch, don't we? But if you've given me slightly more than 30 seconds, I think what I'd start by saying is that there's no absence of people who do risk management in smaller firms. So a lot of people have risk management as their job, whether they realize it or not. There's chances are there's someone leading on cybersecurity, for example. There's probably a legal department that does a lot of the regulatory compliance, defense against claim stuff. HR people manage talent risk. It's just not in their job titles. And I think what someone like me is for or aims to do is kind of put a wrap around all of that to create a self-awareness that there's a lot of different activities around risk management going on, but it all kind of needs to be pulled together, and senior leadership needs a view that all the risks that they need to be worried about and thinking about are indeed being taken care of, being thought about, where there's an absence of focus or more focus is needed, driving that sort of accountability layer, but also recognizing that law firms aren't like the kind of big companies we've been talking about that I was advising that are publicly listed. They might have an entire government relations team, for example, an entire investigations team. So there's some things that law firms don't probably have full-time people doing, like political risk being an example. And maybe 15 years ago, that wasn't a problem. Political risk probably didn't feel that pertinent in the legal sector. But ever since, I think, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, pretty much every law firm that's international will have realized, sooner or later, the political risk is real. So again, someone like me can add focus, I think, on those risks that you're never going to have a full-time resource focusing on as well. So really, I guess, the elevator pitch is it's that wrapper, it's the consistency of approach, and it's the accountability to leadership that appropriate risks are being thought of in a suitably in-depth and forward-looking manner.
And you mentioned consistency to risk there. I guess there's two parts to this question. One, I guess it's this appetite to risk. How do you see the appetite to risk within law firms when, often we say that lawyers are trained to spot risks, aren't they? So, be interested to hear how you see their appetite to risk, and also whether that appetite is universal. So are there certain things that actually, kind of cause more alarm bells than others?
I mean, we could spend a whole hour talking about that. I think risk appetite is a really interesting question. And yes, I've heard that line played back to me in many different ways. Lawyers are naturally risk averse and naturally are risk management experts. And it's funny because I did history at university, and to a certain extent, when you do history, someone expects you to know everything about history. And I find myself constantly saying that wasn't my period. I've never actually studied Henry VIII and all his wives, so I can't recite them back to you. And I think law's the same to a certain extent. You have very specialized lawyers, and actually a property lawyer might not know everything about data privacy or everything about how a large M&A transaction works as well. So that's a slight simplification that all lawyers are naturally and intrinsically risk management experts to start with. But I think to answer your question in a slightly broader sense, it's interesting that being regulated doesn't necessarily drive more caution in the law than it would in other sectors. I think regulation actually, and this is going to perhaps sound shocking to those who only ever worked in the legal sector, isn't as stringent in the legal sector as it is in accounting, for example. I mean, in accounting, we lived in perpetual terror of our regulator, and you did work on the basis that it would be reviewed by the regulator. Every single piece of work you did was liable to be reviewed in one way or another, and that's just not the case in legal services, for example. So to a certain extent, there's a more relaxed approach. I wouldn't say that means carelessness, but also you have a different model, right? Public companies, it's command and control. The risk appetite of the board or the CEO and the leadership team is quite easy, not perfectly easy, but relatively easy to pass down the pyramid through middle management, to the ground level. That's not the case in a law firm where you have 300, 400, 500, potentially more, very opinionated, very educated, but very different owners who all feel like it's their business and they can take it in the direction they want, work with the clients they want to work with, go into the market they want tomorrow. So maintaining kind of risk appetite high line and consistently is much more challenging in a context like a law firm than it is in some of these larger PLCs. So yeah, short answer, it's not as simple as lawyers, risk averse, cautious, fully educated in every area of risk. And that's what makes it interesting. Right? That's why I like working in the sector, because you're talking to super intelligent people, but they would be the first to admit they do have blind spots and they do have, commercial urges that may go against what sort of risk management best practice would look like.
And I do want to come on to another hat that you wear, another hat around something else that you're involved in, which many of our listeners will possibly be aware of. I'm going to actually ask one more question around risk, because I think it will be of interest to many people listening. And I guess, and you've mentioned a couple there already of risks, which perhaps when you started your career weren't necessarily as kind of high on the radar as they are now. So you mentioned cybersecurity there, you mentioned kind of political risk, which, as you said, I think, however many years ago, 20, 30 years ago, I suspect law firms weren't, necessarily looking at that. looking down the track, if you can, with your crystal ball, what do you think is the kind of emerging risks that firms need to be aware of?
I mean, I think, I'm not going to say anything that people don't already know, but I think the two things that are really bubbling up in the conversation, the number one is AI, right? And I love AI as an example of a risk, because risk is actually a value neutral concept. Apologies to those, I'm sort of teaching what they already know, but risk doesn't mean bad. It means uncertainty around objectives. And I love AI as an example because it encapsulates that perfectly. Of course, there's a downside. Everyone's worried about hallucinations. Everyone's worried about algorithmic bias and data privacy breaches and intellectual property infringements. There's all that bundled up in AI usage, which is really important to focus on, but also it's transformative, exciting opportunity that can completely revolutionize the sector, how it works, business model, how we interact with our clients, how we do work, getting rid of some of the boring stuff and so on. And that's the big transformation on the horizon. Like I say, every law firm of every size has to be thinking about, what does this mean for us? What pace do we adopt at? Do we want to be at the front and potentially make all the mistakes first, but get the advantages of being an early mover? Do we want to be in the middle of the pack and have no differentiation, but kind of sort of surf along that wave? Do we want to be at the end and kind of pick up from everyone else's mistakes and make the best choices in terms of which products are good and which ones are not that good for our sector? So that's the big one. I also think climate change is underrated. I think it's easy to think it's not for us. We have nothing to do with it. It just affects us. It affects our clients more than it affects us. We're in glitzy office buildings in downtown European and North American city centres. We're not, in coastal regions of small island nations and so on. But I think that's slightly wrong. I think it's already changed the world. It's changing the dynamics in a lot of sectors. And the reputational risk, Gen Z and Gen Alpha care a lot more about it than previous generations. And I think it has really interesting implications. And it forces us to think outside the law firm window, which is often the next quarter, the next quarter's numbers, maybe if we're lucky, a plan for the year or the next 3 years. But there's a discipline about thinking about the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and climate change starts being really relevant in those kind of timeframes as well, more than geopolitical risk, which is a more immediate one. And there's a tendency to think these big transformative megatrends, we're just recipients of them. We don't have much to do with them. But I'm not sure that's true with climate change, and who we choose to be our clients and what sectors we're comfortable working in and what kind of instructions we're comfortable taking on. So climate change is another really interesting one. That's why the job's so interesting, right? Talking about stuff like cybersecurity involving nation states and geopolitics and climate change and what AI.
Well, absolutely. It just covers everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, you can tell why I like my job, right?
Yeah.
Every day. And these are big conversations to have with smart people. And that's why, people say you work in law, oh God, lawyers, all the sort of bad jokes, but I love it because all the conversations are interesting. Every lawyer you meet is super smart and has a view on what it means for their practice, their clients, their office. So it's permanently innovating.
Well, and also there's that element of, there's the internal piece around what risks are we willing to accept as a firm, but also what are the risks that our clients are willing to take and that are taking, and the interplay between those, and then the legislation that sits on the top, which probably doesn't keep up, and
it certainly doesn't in the
provides yet another lens, doesn't it?
Yeah, and then the kind of added mirror of social media, which again didn't exist as a relevant factor 20, 30 years ago, but the decisions you take around client acceptance, around what instructions you work on, around AI usage potentially or climate change impact, certainly they can be magnified and played back to you in a very critical way, very, very quickly, in a way that simply didn't happen before. And we saw that at the start of the year when the new US administration was very focused on the legal sector. The decisions law firms were taking in real time in very difficult circumstances were being discussed and debated exactly in real time on social media as well. So those decisions are in the spotlight they never were before. And that's super interesting as well.
Now, I didn't want to use Trump as a segue, so I won't, but...
I didn't name him, you went.
But I do want to talk about diversity and neurodiversity in particular. And one of the things that you have done, and I'd love to find a little bit more about why you did it, and for those that don't know about it, to hear a bit more about it, the Legal Neurodiversity Network. So tell us a little bit about why you
happy to. It's my passionate side hustle, so I'm always happy to talk about it. I mean, why it came about, why I'm involved. I guess that takes us back to why I left PwC and why I left kind of frontline client-facing consulting. Around that time that I mentioned, January 2019, was when my son was diagnosed as autistic, and I took a conscious decision to step back from that client-facing kind of fast-paced, long hours, a stressful, frankly, world that is very familiar to lawyers and very similar in the accounting space, for the reason I wanted to be there as that diagnosis unfolded, and to be there more be more present, be more around for my son. So that's when I moved into the in-house role. That explains that kind of sideways step, if that makes sense. And then it was a journey, right? I knew nothing about neurodiversity before it started being mentioned as a possible explanation for why my son was presenting differently at the nursery he was at. So I did what I think most people in our situation do, which is immerse yourself in the subject matter. And that meant, first of all, reading everything I could. And then luckily, when I started at Freshfields, there was a support group for parent carers like me of children with autism and other neurodivergent conditions. So I plunged into that, and that was invaluable. I mean, transformatively helpful. People who'd been down the same journey, but years or months or decades in some cases before, and could share their experience and insights. And it was through that group at HSF that I understood that, there was more to talk about than just what I needed to know for my family, but there was a whole topic of inclusion for people with brains who work differently in the legal services sector. We're not a good sector for encouraging that kind of diversity. There's a bit of a sort of cookie cutter model of what a good lawyer looks like. Our recruitment model, is very old fashioned and hasn't really changed over the years. And likewise, the career progression model is pretty set in stone because it's a buyer's market. There are far more people out there who want legal careers than there are spaces in law firms. So nothing's changed, and that is quite excluding to autistic people and other people with neurodivergent conditions. So there was a conversation to be had about, can we change that? There's a lot of talent out there, a lot of smart, interesting people who would love to work in our organizations and currently are either locked out or in but having a miserable time. So we started talking about that within HSF, and about the same time that I was realizing that I wanted to be vocal on that and active on that, and that it was a passion, and it was about making the world a better place for my son and his generation, but just also felt like an interesting and worthwhile thing to do. The Law Society got in touch and said, we've had a few messages from people in different law firms who are starting to have thoughts about the neurodiversity subject. Seems to be a bit missing from the wider D&I landscape, if you want to call it that. So the Law Society very kindly put a few of us in touch who are having these kind of similar thoughts and taking the sort of first baby steps around neurodiversity inclusion. And we met and talked and decided that, this was an area that wasn't really about competitive advantage and getting one over the next door law firm. It was about sharing stories, what worked, what didn't work. And the power of many was better than the power of one to get this up the agenda and to get it higher in the sort of diversity conversation. So that's the seed from which, long story short, the LNN was born as a concept and then born in practice with a sort of launch event in 2023. And gladly, it's grown very, very quickly from there, which suggests that there was a latent demand for that from HR and D&I professionals who recognised there was a missing link from people with lived experience of neurodiversity inside the sector who felt seen and validated and wanted to amplify that conversation, from parent carers, which was my entry point into the conversation. So from a small group of people in a room facilitated by the Law Society, it's now like 5,000 followers on LinkedIn, 400 people joining Teams calls every quarter, and lots of events and publications and contributions to policy debates and stuff like that. So it's been a fantastic journey, but I think right concept at right time to surf a wave of interest and passion, and it's been really rewarding.
And I've got lots of questions that I can follow on from that, but I think, again, I didn't want to jump straight into the myths, but I'm going to, because I think, so obviously you and I have spoken before, and you and I share many things in common. We keep finding new connections that we have in common. The fact that both of our children are autistic. And I think it's fair to say that particularly with girls present differently. My daughter, now I know, I can see signs that were present, obviously, from, very early on, but it was never anything that I, kind of knew about. My view of autism was very much a stereotypical view of what you see, the stereotypes, the Sheldon, the, Rain Man, all of those stereotypes. And actually it's been eye-opening for me to find out more. And so I do want to start with myth busting, I think. And what are the myths that you hear again and again that frustrate you, that you would like to use this podcast to kind of bust or break through?
Just a bit. I missed the narrative was that I am now myself diagnosed autistic with ADHD as well. So that was not the culmination of the journey, but that was another twist the tale took, that recognizing things in my son and the diagnostic conversations around him forced us turning of the mirror on myself and so on. So yes, I'm even more passionate about myth busting perhaps than I was before, because it feels directly and personally relevant. But there are so many myths, aren't there, Claire, where to start? I mean, the one I always grind my teeth out a bit is the sort of, we're all a bit autistic, everyone's on the spectrum one. We could spend time talking about that. The whole vaccines cause autism one. I'd probably park that one. I like to think most people have moved beyond that one, at least in the UK. And then there's what sort of slightly clunky ones you mentioned, Sheldon, that all autistic people are amazing at maths and chess, and I wish I'm terrible at both. So, parking those, and our hobbies are all Minecraft and train spotting. Not the case for me. I like football and working out, just perhaps not such a stereotype. But I think those are probably obvious enough that most sensible people have moved on from those. I think the one I find really damaging actually around autism in particular is the empathy perception, and I think that particularly goes for the male presentation of autism. I think that's less of a stereotype, actually. One few benefits perhaps of being an autistic female compared to autistic male, if that's not quite thrown at autistic female so much, but the sort of autistic men are emotionally dead and feel no empathy is really damaging. It's amazing how widespread that remains. I think it's not helped by some fairly prominent people in all walks of life who've been accused of various levels of misdemeanors, from being sexist on MasterChef all the way through to committing mass murder in recent months, immediately trying to blame autism as the sort of causal factor of that. That really isn't helped. That kind of stereotype almost spread and grow. And meeting and working with lots of autistic people as I do now, it couldn't be further from the truth. You see such deep levels of compassion and identification with others, and a sort of justice sensitivity to try and make wrongs right and get involved in making things better. But it's just a really classic example of imputing how autistic people may present, and some of us are quite monotonous in our delivery. I've been told that myself, how we communicate or how we present in social settings, and imputing from that a feeling that because we seem shy or awkward, or perhaps not making eye contact, or not being touchy-feely and grasping people by the hand when we meet them, that somehow that translates into a lack of empathy. And I think that's really damaging, as well as, obviously, as I've said, from the people I know and care about and have supporting the work I do, and the work they do that I support couldn't be further from the truth. So yeah, if it was one myth that I'd like to bust, it's that sort of autism equals lack of empathy. It's really dangerous, actually.
Yeah, and I think,
don't know if that resonates with you, or
and I'm just reflecting that we could, again, we could spend hours and hours talking about this, and I've been reflecting in my mind what's the one thing that actually I would want people to know. And I think the thing that I found most helpful with Anna to understand, and it's the thing that I think I get most frustrated by, is this idea of high functioning versus low functioning, and that it's a linear, you're either on this side or that side, and actually understanding that it's a fact. They present now with they show you a circle and there are different elements, and effectively everyone who has autism has a slightly different profile. And this idea of, well, if you're high functioning, then you're okay, and if you're low functioning, then you're not okay, because actually, and we're going to talk about parent carers, because your journey's almost come full circle, hasn't it? Because you just announced an initiative around parent carers with the LNN. This idea of kind of, I think for me with Anna, she masks a lot, and she, people will look at her and say, oh, but she's fine. And she is fine. She's not broken. she, but the environments that sometimes she is in do not, enable her to be able to thrive, and they leave her absolutely exhausted. I think that for me is the thing that hurts as a parent of a child with autism. This idea of, well, she's high functioning, therefore she must be okay, and therefore, discussion flows almost.
I hate that one too, because it also writes off people on the other end, right? And my son would not be classified as high functioning; he'd be classified as high needs, and that, again, the sort of sense that high functioning people okay is unfair because they're often not, but also that suggests that low functioning is low value, low merit, low worth to society, and that's very dangerous territory. And talking about going down rabbit holes, I have a family history in Austria, and I was fascinated that the sort of origins of autism diagnosis were in Vienna, where my family comes from, and it was also in Vienna that the Nazis kind of perfected their program of euthanasia and sterilization of disabled people, and they had exactly that distinction between low value autistic people who weren't worthy of living and those who were slightly brighter and could potentially function. So I think it's very, very damaging and dangerous when you start sorting people into boxes like that on both sides of the ledger. But often the conversation focuses on high functioning autistic people and the struggles they have, and it forgets that it's very, very reductive and dismissive and kind of outrageous to sort of write off everyone else when everyone has strengths and weaknesses, as you said. And that concept of a spiky profile and challenges in different areas, whether that's sensory processing or verbal communication or emotional regulation, each presentation is valid and each is a genuine and authentic representation of autism. That's, again, it's a difficult message because it's much less simple than just autistic people look like Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory, you know what I mean? But it's, these are kind of myths we have to work particularly hard to at least chip away at. They're not going to fall down overnight, I don't think. And the media doesn't help, frankly. As I've said, the presentations and then the coverage of it in contexts like misconduct and criminal activity just set us back, 2 steps back for every 1 step forward we do manage to make in the public sphere with a bit of positive advocacy. So the fight goes on.
And again, we're talking about autism because we have that kind of in common. But, again, I think sometimes there is, and it's almost become a myth, hasn't it, that neurodiversity equals autism, and possibly ADHD sometimes as well. But, obviously, neurodiversity is huge and also a topic which we could speak about for a long time. And I think I don't want to go down that rabbit hole now because of time. I think what I do want to do is I want to zoom out a little bit, because I think the more I learn about different things and the more I read, and, one of the things I would, across all different areas, I think, if you're curious, there are so many resources out there that you can find out, whether it's documentaries or books or podcasts, or, if you are curious, there are ways that you can find out more about whatever it is that you're curious about. But it strikes me that actually we are all individuals. We all need different things in order to show up at our best and thrive. And I'm not sure how well different sectors respond to that, but I think the legal sector is one that probably, I'm not in it anymore. I kind of look into it, so I might be being unfair, but there's an element of rigidity around, the hours, around the environment in which you work, that, isn't necessarily the right environment to help everyone thrive. With the LLN, what are the sorts of things that you hear that you think, okay, there are always things that can be done, and some of those things, a bit like with the risk work that you do, that are huge things that actually, yes, that in an ideal world, wouldn't it be lovely? But, we're so far away from that. But there must be a number of things that you hear that actually are really small, that would make such a difference and probably don't have a high cost and wouldn't have a massive impact on clients. So perhaps you can share some of those things that you think, well, actually, if law firms did that, it would just have such a big impact without them perhaps even realising the enormity of the impact of that thing that they could do.
Yeah, I mean, I love the framing of the question, Claire, and you've phrased it really well. I think the rigidity is a strong one, and there's a reason why the LNN is important, because it is a difficult sector. That we don't shy away from saying that it's not the most neuro-inclusive sector. Tech and computer programming has got it a lot better, and the creative industries to a certain extent. There's a reason why there's a lot of ADHD singers and autistic screenwriters and DJs and so on. There are easier environments in law, so you're right, and there are some structural barriers. I think how we recruit, how we promote and measure success, the billable hour model, as you mentioned, and indeed the stereotype of what a good lawyer looks like are all really big structural ones that I'll be the first to admit the LNN hasn't got a solution to that yet. We're having the conversations, but you're right, there are so many things that can help around the edges. And I think the point I really want to make to anyone who's a bit skeptical listening to this is the areas I'm about to talk about inclusively work for everyone. They're not just something that has to be sort of surgically targeted at individual autistic or ADHD or dyslexic or dyspraxic people you might not even know you have in your workforce. So examples like giving people flexibility in how they work. Not everyone surely has to start at 9 a.m. and get on the most crowded tube trains and suddenly go home at the busiest time in the evenings. Not everyone has to be in the office on the same days. Not everyone has to be in an open plan office. Or people shouldn't be banned from wearing, headphones. That helps with everyone's productivity and giving people a bit of flexibility about how they work, how often they need to come into the office. That works for parent carers, women with child raising responsibilities, people who have a longer commute to work, perhaps for social mobility reasons, because they can't afford to live in central areas of cities and so on as well. So there's a social mobility and inclusion aspect to flexible working. Then there's removing normative and subjective aspects from your career development framework. So I mentioned the billable hour. Perhaps it will take AI to bring that down, but we shouldn't be rewarding people on whether they have firm handshakes or whether they make eye contact or whether they're the alpha in the room, who owns the room with a client, or basically rewarding only extrovert behaviors. And again, I think that's important for neurodivergent talent to recognize that some lawyers present in different ways, and they're introvert and they're really good at getting deep into a subject and writing fantastic research papers or notes, whatever it may be, rather than just being all about the firm handshake and the strong eye contact. But that also works for other minority groups as well, who didn't necessarily present in that alpha framework. And the most important variable, which I think helps with every single team member, is considerate, flexible management. Right? The biggest variable, I think, for any neurodivergent individual in any law firm is whether their manager is kind and compassionate or is just a bit inflexible and only communicates in one way and only thinks feedback should be given in one way, meetings should be run in one way, and instructions should be delivered in one way. That's the biggest challenge on a day-to-day basis. So managers who can flex their style a little bit, who can be empathetic to different feedback styles or working styles or awareness of deadlines or help with prioritization. That doesn't cost a thing, but having inclusively minded managers is transformative. And basically, it doesn't matter what the policies say, it doesn't really matter what the office looks like. If you've got a compassionate manager, you can make it work. And if you don't, it's probably not going to work, even if your policies are amazing and you've got the neuro-inclusive carpeting in the office and the sort of soundproofed quiet rooms people go into. If your manager's being mean to you every day, then it's probably not going to work. So that's the biggest variable. And again, it costs nothing except giving managers skills, awareness, training that they will have neurodiverse teams in the legal sector. It's not an if, it's a definite. They might not know it, they might not be disclosed to them, but their teams will be neurodiverse. And if they can flex their leadership style just slightly, and it's not easy, client deadlines, busy workloads and so on, that can be transformative. So I think it comes down to the human factor. And we talk a lot about that in the LNM, sort of how you can raise the level and the bar of just inclusive leadership.
And as you say, for me, and you kind of ended there with inclusive leadership, I think it's, and I'll kind of circle back to what I was saying around, at the end of the day, we are all human. And often when I'm coaching leaders, I will say to them, well, how often do you ask your team, how do they like, how would they like to receive information? Are they, would they like the, meetings is a good example, isn't it? Would they like the agenda before the meeting, or are they happy to just, wing it in the moment? There are so many different little nuances which will help your team perform better, whether they are, whether they have autism, whether they have, or whether they don't, whether they're just actually, I'm the sort of person that needs to have the agenda beforehand or whatever it might be. So
I love that example. If you don't mind a tiny anecdote, I was mentoring a young lady, autistic lady, who's just starting her career in the legal profession, and she just got her first permanent job, having done an internship that I helped her access. And it was in her second week, I think, someone put a meeting in her calendar that was just called Career Chat. And she called me in a blind panic because she assumed that meant she was going to get fired. And it's just a very, very simple thing, but just taking the time to write in the body of that meeting invitation, just to check in to see how you're doing after 2 weeks, nothing to worry about. Or, we'll just go through, the 3 bullet points. Have you done your induction training, whatever it is? Have you had tea with your buddy? Have you done the first task? Anything that would have made it clearer than just going to a worst case scenario would have been more inclusive. And there's just a tiny little mindful things that take 10 seconds that can make such a difference. So absolutely.
And and I see that with my daughter. Sometimes I'll say, "Oh, Anna, I need to speak to you," and she'll be, "What have I done wrong?"
Yeah, exactly. Straight to catastrophizing, and that comes from a life, right, of being made to feel like you're awkward or things are difficult. It's corrosive, and that's why we need to be supportive and empathetic, I think, in our leadership styles.
So I mentioned that you've come full circle, and you have recently, my teeth in, recently launched an initiative around parent carers. So can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the core focus on the LNN, as I mentioned, is supporting neurodivergent talent, helping people access the profession and then stay in and thrive in the profession when it's not necessarily the easiest profession to do that. And so that's our core focus. But we've always been aware alongside that, as we've cranked up, that there's a massive population of people who are that one step removed from neurodiversity. So not necessarily neurodivergent themselves, although a lot of parent carers are also neurodivergent. Of course, it comes from somewhere, but there's that big parent carer population, and a truly inclusive neurodiversity strategy recognizes that population too. It's very quiet. Often it doesn't make a large noise, but it is a stressful existence, as you will know, Claire. Accessing education, support, the systems aren't as conducive as we'd like them to be. Waiting lists for diagnosis can be long. There can be medication shortages. Many parents are in constant kind of fight or flight mode on behalf of their children. And actually, similar to our previous conversation about adjustments for staff, some of the things that organizations can do to make the parent carer populations that, again, they definitely do have, whether they know it or not, among their workforce and then even at their partner level when they're solicitor firms, are very low cost and very impactful without necessarily being very difficult to organize. So we're talking about things like having support groups for parent carers to meet each other, providing flexible working patterns, exactly as I said, for neurodivergent staff as well, offering people the ability to go to meetings and medical appointments during the day without judgment, or be penalising them on their chargeable hour targets. Organising social events during the day rather than after work makes life easy for parent carers as well. And none of these come with a cost, but they can all make parent carers who, as I said, do have a stressful life. It's not stressful because of their children, it's stressful because of the systems that should be supporting their children and aren't, feel more included. And the payback you get from that, as I say, doesn't cost anything to start with. The payback you get in terms of loyalty, productivity, commitment, and potentially advocacy as well. Your parent carers can be some of your best foot soldiers in your neurodiversity, advocacy and campaigning, as well as I suspect my story shows. Should make it a no-brainer to think about some of those things. So yes, the LNN. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to plug it at the end of our conversation. We've just released a report, free and available to everyone on our LinkedIn page, that sets out 10 things that we think every legal services employee, regardless of size or shape or budget, could be thinking about doing just to make life a bit easier for that population, and help them out, and then help them help you by being more present and more able to contribute at work as well. So if that sounds like of interest, whether you're in that situation as a parent carer yourself or in an HR or DI role, have a look. I think there's something in there for everyone.
And we will put a link to that in the show notes. So if anyone is interested, they can go there. But I am, because you mentioned there are 10 things, I'm not going to ask you to tell us the 10. I'm not a memory test, but of those 10, which was the one that surprised you the most?
Of the recommendations? Mm-hmm. I'm not sure about a surprise. I mean, I wrote things, so I guess none of them were surprising because we heard them in conversations with parents and carers, and they've been familiar in topics of conversation. The most easy one and the most basic one that I'd suggest every organisation does is the support group. I mean, that's literally just make a meeting room available. If you're feeling really generous, put some biscuits and a pot of tea in the middle of the table, and just let people meet each other and share their stories and feel seen and offer support to each other. As I mentioned, that was the start of my journey, was joining the equivalent support group for that at HSF, and that started everything for me in terms of feeling seen and having access to help and advice. At the cutting edge, this is where you might be surprised, the legal sector is at the cutting edge, and that's where I applaud legal services employees. They're doing stuff that bigger and listed companies aren't doing yet, like they're providing subsidized or even fully paid access to diagnosis. I'm loving seeing that. I think they just made a big splash last year announcing a new benefit where not just staff but family members of staff can access private diagnosis under their medical health insurance. And that, when you're potentially looking at a 3 or 4 year waiting list in some postcodes on the NHS, that's transformative. That can be game changing. If you can access a diagnosis quicker, that can change your access to education. It can obviously open doorway to medication if you've got ADHD and you've been struggling in certain contexts of work. So stuff like that, once one law firm does it, other law firms copy, and it's just a sort of virtuous circle effect. And now more and more law firms are also bringing in paid carers leave. And the evidence is most people don't use it, but just knowing it's there makes you feel better. Right? Knowing that if you had to take a day next week because suddenly your kid's out of school, or there's that absolutely crucial appointment that you have to go and be there, that you won't be penalised and your employer will support you to take that day to look after your family. That, again, psychologically be transformative. So I'm loving seeing law firms at the vanguard of implementing those kind of practices. And again, those cost money, right? Subsidized diagnosis is not cheap. Paid carers leave obviously comes at a cost as well. So we're not saying every legal services provider from the smallest high street solicitors firm can and should be implementing those, but that's the direction of travel, and it is great and encouraging. I've been a little bit critical of the sector in many ways because there's work to do, but I'm loving seeing us actually setting the tone for some of our clients in that and being ahead of the curve. I mentioned we weren't in risk management, but in some areas of neurodiversity and fusion we are, and that's probably a positive note to end on.
Thank you so much for speaking to me. I mean, there are so many different angles that I would still love to talk to you about, but we're going to have to leave everyone wanting more. I certainly would love to continue to talk to you about a number of the things that we've discussed today. But I agree, it's nice to end on a positive. So thank you for giving.
Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope it has been of interest. It's obviously these are subjects of passion for me, whether it's professional or personal. So I always enjoy talking about them. And if anyone wants to get in touch after the podcast, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to talk about stuff.
That was James Smither, Global Head of Risk Management at Freshfields, talking to Claire Rayson. Lawyers Coach is brought to you by Client Talk. If you're a lawyer and would like to take part in Lawyers Coach, please visit our website lawyercoach.co.uk for further details. And you can also join the conversation on the Client Talk LinkedIn page. If there are any topics you'd like to hear us discuss, then just get in touch.